Our event today is co-organized by SAWA for Development and Aid and colleagues at the Refugee Research and Policy Program at the Isam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. So before starting, I would like to say thank you so much to Yara Murad, who's here, and Watfa Najdi also, and other colleagues who have supported in planning and executing this. It is also supported by the Lebanon Policy and Research Network on Displacement, LPRND, which is based at IFI and which, in addition to SAWA, IFI, Basma and Zaytun and others, consists of a community of civil society actors, NGOs, academics, and journalists who work together since 2016 on issues pertaining to displacement, notably to address the negative narrative associated with refugees and influencing policymaking in a way that promotes refugee dignity and rights. Of course, this is a side event, which is in the light of the Brussels 7 conference on supporting the future of Syria and the region. Wow, seventh conference on Syria. This is quite a long time. But most importantly, this event is of paramount importance because it is here to address the dangerous escalation that we have witnessed in the past few months against Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And in the light of the rising hate speech and calls for unsafe return of refugees to Syria. This panel aims at opening spaces of discussion among Syrian, Lebanese, and international stakeholders on the need to protect refugees and to uphold that return should always be safe, voluntary, and dignified. We have today with us 5 excellent speakers. I'm very happy to present them briefly before we move to the questions. Dr. Fouad is a Syrian professor of public health at the American University of Beirut, and he's the IDRC Research Chair on Forced Displacement at the Middle East Center. Dr. Fouad has extensive experience on refugee health and well-being, in addition to the political economy of health and armed conflict. Welcome, Dr. Fouad. We have also with us Mrs. Tracy Mulfair, who is the Deputy Representative on Protection at the UNHCR in Lebanon since July 2021. She has worked for UNHCR since 2001 in various fields on operations and at headquarters. Her latest assignments have been including a Senior Policy and Guidance Coordinator in Geneva, Senior Policy Advisor and Development Solutions in New York, and Assistant Representative of Protection in Pakistan. So she has both the bureaucratic and the field experience to share with us today. I'd like to also introduce Mr. Ali Murad. Mr. Ali is a Lebanese legal expert and political activist. He is also a university lecturer in France and Lebanon for more than 15 years in constitutional and administrative law, including the legal and constitutional framework of decentralization, but also local authorities. He is also currently senior legal advisor at Kulluna Irada. Welcome, Ali. Mr. Fadi Haliso. Last but not least, no, actually, there's one more. So Mr. Fadi Haliso is a civil engineer from Aleppo, and he's a development consultant that co-founded and manages the organization Basma and Zaytun, a relief and a development organization working with refugees and local communities in Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq. Hi, Fadi. Finally, Mrs. Lynn Ksaibi, she is part of the Policy Research and Advocacy Department at SAWA for Development and Aid. She works on issues pertaining to refugee rights, protection, HLP, among others. She is Syrian and a graduate from the American University of Beirut in communication arts before bridging her expertise to the service of the humanitarian sector and journalism. So welcome everyone. Just a few housekeeping arrangements before we start. We have chosen this setting as a webinar just to allow for the maximum number of participants to join and to allow for the smoother running of the panel. However, we do value a lot the interactive discussion that can happen with the attendees. So I will ask everyone to refrain from asking your questions at the Q&A box, but instead to wait until we finish our rounds of questions, and I will open up to discussion. So if anyone has any questions or comments at the end of the panel, you can simply raise your hand and I will move you to a speaker and unmute you, and then you can ask the questions yourself. So again, just for the late joiners, there is a live translation available because some speakers will be speaking in Arabic, and you can find it at the bottom of the screen and you can choose your preferred language. Okay, so Fadi, I'm going to start with you. actually, and ask you if you can brief us a little bit about the recent security crackdown that targeted Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Why is it so scary this time, and how has it affected the Syrian refugee communities?
Hello, everyone. Actually, what we have been seeing for the last 2 months is a whole-scale campaign against Syrians' presence in Lebanon by different political parties and personalities, even some ministries, threatening to deport Syrians because Lebanon doesn't take it anymore, and the refugee burden is bigger than Lebanon's to handle. And suddenly, and of course, it resonated a lot with the public opinion, especially in certain areas of Lebanon. We've seen this campaign being implemented by security forces, but also sometimes by municipalities. It encouraged also some inhabitants, some Lebanese population to tell the security forces about the Syrians present in their villages that they thought they are illegal. From what the authorities were saying is that they are targeting the Syrians who entered Lebanon illegally after 2019. And those are the only ones who will be deported. However, we have some cases, colleagues in human rights organizations in Lebanon have documented cases of people who have not entered Lebanon illegally and been deported. The number of deportees is above 400, I think. Some of them were handed over to the 4th Division of the Syrian Army, and some were left on the border, who a few days later had to borrow some money from relatives and paid $400 to smugglers to get back to Lebanon. As a result, the situation that this created is a situation of total fear. Many Syrians now are stranded to their homes, tents, or wherever they are staying, not daring to go out and in fear of being arrested and deported, even though some have legal documentation. The problem is always in the broad ability to interpret any directive from the government in regards to Syria. When we say there was also some calls, to deport Syrians in prisons because the prisons are overcrowded and do not have any more places. So the problem that this kind of language allows everyone to assume that all people in the prison are criminals, which is not the case. Any Syrian without proper documentation can be arrested in the streets and thrown into the prison. And most of the time they have no proper documentation because renewing the residency is too expensive, is too complicated, and for big families it is a huge burden that they cannot afford. So you can, if there is close monitoring of the situation of people in prison, you will discover hundreds or thousands of people with such cases that didn't commit any crime, but to be arrested on a checkpoint because their papers expired. So in short, this is the situation. Many Syrians now are considering going to Europe by the sea again and weighing their options with smugglers. And we fear that once the sea is calm enough, maybe in a week or two, we can witness a new wave of immigration that will be catastrophic this time, because the road, as we all know, from Lebanon to Europe is too long, too dangerous, and the boats do not take the long trip.
Yes. So Fadi, This is really alarming what you are saying, and we have been witnessing in fear this crackdown. I just want to move quickly to Dr. Fuad. فؤاد مع حفظ الألقاب للجميع. What is the fate of some of these refugees? يعني Fadi has mentioned briefly, but those who have been forcefully in Syria during this most recent security crackdown, what has been their fate upon returning?
Well, thank you, Ruba, and thank you for the organizer for inviting me. And I would like to apologize for any noise around me. I'm in travel speaking. I mean, the internet in my room collapsed, so I'm speaking in a public venue. So again, sorry for that. So back to your question, Ruba. I think Fadi mentioned something about those who return. Interestingly or sadly, we don't know exactly what could happen for people who go back. This is a very black box. We don't know exactly who returned. We don't know exactly what happened with them. We don't know exactly what is the fate of them. What we know now, the little information that we know it is from some international organization. On the top is Amnesty International organization that was able to document cases, of returnees, and even did interviews with them or their relatives. And I would like to put two issues here. One, refugees and therefore returnees are not one mass. They came from different to Lebanon for different reasons. And actually, after 10 years, they have a different, even a future. So, if any. A second is that the main issue of this anti-refugee campaign focus on young people and men in specific, and that's why we see many of them, those who are enforced or were arrested and then enforced to return, or put them actually not just enforced. They are captured and put them on the border, or sometimes they cross the border and handle them to the Syrian armies. So one of the main issue is what Fadi mentioned about the military service. Many came to Lebanon escaping from military service. They don't want to serve in military for many reasons. It's not the subject for our conversation today. But many, they don't want to serve, in military, and that's the main risk for people. Second, actually, is some of them who came, at the beginning, either facted from the army, or being a protest, or have a record of being, supporting opposition, or for any reason that the government, Syrian government, are putting them in a list. Those will be on the high risk of persecution and of course the consequence of such a sort of persecution that could affect their even life. We know Amnesty documented cases for two people that were disappeared, after sent them back to Lebanon, and some actually even after return they either pay again to smuggler to come back to Lebanon, or they even pay to go to Turkey, to Idlib. And that's another issue. And of course there are many women, children of those who return with their relatives are now without shelter, because they return to areas without that already distracted. So I mean, hopefully we can come back again, but there's a lot of issues.
Oh. Thank you so much. Thank you. And here I want to move to Lynn. We have some previous experience in the last years, but especially in the last year, because approximately a year ago, the state of Lebanon has put forth a plan, an open plan about refugee return. How did that plan go, Ian? And what are some of the learning outcomes that came out of it? What do we know about this former formal plan that happened last year?
Okay. Hi, everyone. So yes, Ruba, correct. SOA followed up on the return plan that was announced by the government in 2022. And the plan mainly intended to return 15,000 refugees to Syria per month. It was first announced in 2017, then it was halted because of COVID, and then it resumed to operate again last year. So what happened was that 2 convoys of returnees took off from Lebanon on October 26th and on November 5, carrying out a total of around 660 refugees towards towns and villages of Western Qalamun in Syria. Now, on the other side, inside Syria and within the localities that refugees went to, conditions of a safe, dignified, and sustainable returns were not really met. Because returnees who returned to the area of Qalamun stated that their localities still suffered from security gaps, it still suffered from the effects of war, the destruction of its infrastructure, all of this in the light of a continuous security approach and a collapsing economy. All of these factors have pushed the same people who decided to return to Syria back again to Lebanon. And we've spotted around 30% of refugees doing a reverse return. But what was interesting actually about this whole process was actually the selection of returnees who were going back to Syria. In the first cohort, the Lebanese General Authority submitted a list of 2,000 names to the Syrian government. The Syrian government only approved 1,000, and around 500 people were only able to cross the borders in reality. And this sharp decline of numbers of acceptances, it indicates that the regime is not really serious about return plans, nor is it willing to exert any efforts to bring back people, which is actually alarming. We also noticed that despite affirmation by the Lebanese government that the return is voluntary, given that the Lebanese authorities did not indeed enforce anyone in the last 2 convoys to return, they exerted attempts to pressure refugees through security raids, through limitation of access to humanitarian aid, in addition to hate speech. So if we want to talk about the lessons learned, we need to shed the light that exerting such pressure did not and will not succeed in achieving a real return that relieves the burdens of displacement on Lebanon, nor will it support the refugees to attain a safe, dignified, or sustainable return. On the contrary, what such practices could do is that it will push people to taking risky decisions of unsafe return or illegal immigration, which might contribute to the destabilization of situation in both Lebanon and Syria amid rising hate speech. So, key solution of refugee crisis, it lies in Syria and it does not lie in Lebanon. And given the political deadlock, the continuation of the security approach in Syria, forced conscription, kidnapping, it seems like talks about mass returns of refugees to Syria are still premature and almost impossible. If we want to talk about a return that is realistic, then the circumstances might take place that the return could be a gradual one. A return should be to certain localities, and it should require the deconstruction of the refugee narrative and coordination on different levels.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I will remind everyone again that live translation is available. Our next speaker will be talking in Arabic. So if you want to choose interpretation, you click on the small globe and you choose your preferred language. You're going to hear me say that a lot of times during this panel. Ali, يعني based على اللي حكيته لين عن
based on what Lynn has mentioned on the anti-Syrians campaign, and based on the campaign that was launched 1 year ago by the Lebanese government, do you think that the Lebanese government is adopting a new policy to deal with the refugees, and how do you describe it? How is it different
للحملة الأمنية اللي عم بتصير اليوم بلبنان ضد اللجنة السورية؟
يعني بداية بس بدي أشكرك ربا وأشكر كل المشاركين والمشاركات. بعتقد الوضع اللي كنا عايشينه بلبنان من أسابيع ماضية اليوم اختفى أو خف، وهذه ظاهرة كل سنة سنتين ثلاثة بنشوف هذه الموجة في لبنان، وهذا دليل على أنه الدولة اللبنانية لا يوجد لديها خطة حتى باستخدام الوسائل العنفية والعنصرية وتوظيفها كما فعلت بقية الدول. الدولة اللبنانية كما فشلت في إدارة كل الملفات الوطنية الداخلية من الكهرباء للمي وغيره بتأمين حاجات اللبنانيين، فشلت بإدارة ملف اللاجئين، وفشلت منذ اليوم الأول عندما قررت طوعاً أن تتنازل عن حق السيادة بتسجيل اللاجئين. ربما الانقسام السياسي حول الموقف من الثورة بسوريا، لأنه هون مهم ورح أعطي كثير إشارات بهذا المحل أنا بمداخلاتي. الحدث السوري لم يكن يوماً حدثاً غير لبناني. السياسة في لبنان جزء منها، وهذا منذ بالحد الأدنى منذ الحرب الأهلية. السياسة في لبنان جزء منها والداخل السوري، والداخل السوري جزء، والسياسة بسوريا جزء منها الداخل اللبناني. وبالتالي اليوم الزعم عدد من اللبنانيين على أن ما يجري في سوريا خارجنا، يكفي أن نرى أن عدد من القوات اللبنانية جزء من اللبنانيين يقاتلون بسوريا، وبالتالي الحدث السوري ليس خارج لبنان. السياسة اللبنانية كما كل الأمور هي سياسة اللا سياسة منذ اليوم الأول، سياسة اللا سياسة، وحتى بإدارة الأزمة الأخيرة. ونحن كنا نتوقع هذا الأمر، أن تصل الموجة إلى حدها الأقصى ومن ثم تخفت دون الخروج بأي حلول، ويبقى الوضع على ما هو عليه. من جهة هنالك بيع أوهام للناس ما يزيد من خطاب كراهية علينا كل يوم وفي كل لحظة وفي كل دقيقة أن نتصدى له، ولكن علينا أن ننظر بعين أخرى، وهي هذا المجتمع اللبناني هو مجتمع قلق، هو مجتمع تحللت فيه الدولة، هو مجتمع يعاني من أزمات انقسام داخلي، لأنه أصلا في توازنات داخلية دقيقة جدا وعنصرية وطائفية وانقسامات كاملة داخل المجتمع اللبناني. وأجد أن هذا الأمر في كثير من الأمور لا يؤخذ بعين الاعتبار عند نقاش هذه المسائل، ليس من باب لتبرير العنصرية، على العكس تماما، لمعرفة كيف نتصدى جديا لهذا الشيء من خلال تقديم حلول. والتجارب قدامنا بأوروبا واضحة. مواجهة خطاب الكراهية لوحده لم يستطع أن يوقف تمدد اليمين المتطرف الفاشي ومن انتشاره. التصدي للعنصرية هذا واجب علينا كلبنانيين مؤمنين بحقوق الإنسان، علينا كلبنانيين حتى أن نحمي بكل الطرق الممكنة اللاجئين واللاجئات السوريين والسوريات في لبنان. ولكن أيضا بعد 12 سنة من الحرب في سوريا، بالنسبة لي ثورة، بالنسبة لحدا تاني تكون مؤامرة، بعد 12 سنة من انسداد أفق الحل السياسي، بعتقد يمكن بحاجة كلنا بشجاعة أن نفكر بمقاربة جديدة. هذا اللبنان بالرغم من كل مشاكله استطاع أن يستوعب ثلث سكانه يدخل إليه بأقل من سنتين، وهو دولة متحللة ومتعددة ومنقسمة وفيها توازنات بسيطة جدا. وجاء الانهيار ليزيد من هذا الأمر، غياب أي أفق للحل السياسي يزيد من الأمر. نحن نعيش في شرق لم يعد ما في مهجر رجع، خلينا نكون واضحين. وبالتالي هذا القلق الذي يواجهه المجتمع اللبناني والأسئلة التي يعبر عنها بطريقة خاطئة وبطريقة عنصرية، علينا أن ندرك كلنا من المجتمع الدولي ومن المنظمات الدولية ونحن كلبنانيين وأيضا كمجتمع مدني سوري كيف نتعامل معه، ليس لتبريره، عم عيدها بعد مرة لما انفهم غلط، للمواجهة الشجاعة بهذا المحل، لأنه كلنا معنيين بهذا المحل. رح نحكي بالحلول حتما، بس أنا كنت بحاجة ثبت هذه الأمور بالأول.
شكرا كثير علي. يعني it's refreshing to hear also from our Lebanese colleagues and partners and companions who stand always in solidarity of the Syrian refugees, right? Tracy, we've heard a lot so far about the crackdowns, the security situation. how have, يعني, is everything that we have heard affecting the refugees' intentions on return? I know that UNHCR, surveys annually return intentions, and normally feeds also into the Brussels conference that we hold this side event in advance of. How have everything we have heard affected, if at all, Syrian refugees' intentions on return?
Thank you, Ruba, and thank you to Sawa and to IFI. I'm really happy to join this panel and to come together to talk about these important issues in the run-up to the 7th Brussels conference. As always, the conference remains an important event in terms of funding, as well as to maintain key focus on these policy issues that really matter. This year, we've seen a concerning drop in the amount of funding made available so far for the humanitarian and stabilization response in Lebanon, no doubt because of competing priorities. However, we've also seen the needs and vulnerabilities of refugees alongside Lebanese grow deeper and more entrenched in the last few years in the face of the crises Lebanon has faced. But institutional capacity has not been able to keep up. So the services have diminished as the needs have grown. Thus, discussions on durable solutions like this one and the various impediments that continue to exist are really important to underline the urgent need to take action to maintain protection space and ongoing support to refugees in Lebanon in the medium term, alongside steps to tackle barriers to return and solutions. As Ruba said, every year we conduct a return intention survey, which just keeps and helps us maintain an understanding of how refugees see return, and it helps to inform our approach to the situation. So I'll begin with some reflections on the latest intention survey, and then move on to focus on the actual return figures for the year and the correlation between the two. So the overall findings from this year's survey are very similar to previous years. Based on what refugees tell UNHCR, most refugees in the region want to return to Syria. However, only a small number intend to do so in the next 12 months. Just to quickly recap, this is the 8th iteration of the regional survey on Syrian refugees' perceptions and intentions, and it's conducted this year in Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. So this was done in January and February this year. And in that study, 56% of respondents indicated their overall intention to return. And this could be at any point in time. The small number of Syrian refugees that expressed their intention to return in the next 12 months was about 1.1%. So it was a minority of that overall figure. But we can dig a little bit into that and what drives refugees' intentions to return. And it's overwhelmingly the situation on the ground in Syria. And it's a number of factors. It's not one thing that helps them or propels them to make a decision. So some of the factors, the most prevalent ones, are the lack of predictable safety and security, the lack of livelihood opportunities, the lack of housing, and the lack of basic services on the ground in Syria. Safety and security concerns go beyond issues related to armed conflicts. They involve unpredictability around military service, as well as fears of arrest and detention. These are things that refugees repeatedly tell us are influencing their decisions on return. Let's see, I'll skip that and move on to the next. The lack of livelihood and work opportunities also remains an important obstacle to return and was the most cited factor in this year's survey, usually in combination with safety and security concerns. I can't emphasize enough that there's different factors involved, and it's usually not one that's influencing refugees' opinions. So based on the results of the survey, UNHCR would just like to stress the continued importance of the international community maintaining a comprehensive protection and solutions response to the Syria crisis. What this means is assisting host communities and countries to preserve asylum systems and a protection environment. We've heard a little bit about that already today, while enhancing medium-term support to strengthen host country resilience and also enable refugee self-reliance, as well as expanding resettlement and other safe pathways to third countries. There's a number of steps in there, but all are incredibly needed to maintain the response. I said I'd talk about the actual returns this year, and this will be the last thing I discuss. So this, the verified returns from UNHCR also keep in line with what we're saying. So the returns seem to follow the same. While in 2022 and 2023, there's been increasing negative rhetoric. We've been talking about that already. And there's been increasing calls for return of refugees. And the conditions are deteriorating for refugees who are living in Lebanon. However, despite all three of those factors, actual returns remain at a low scale. This just underlines the fact I was saying earlier that decision-making is primarily driven by the situation in Syria and by a number of factors, and not driven by the situation in Lebanon. Let me just close very quickly by adding some numbers to what I'm talking about verified returns. In 2020,
If you have 1 minute left.
right?
You have 1 minute left.
That's fine, I will be done. In 2022, UNHCR verified 9,814 returns from Lebanon to Syria. This includes 701 individuals who returned as part of the organized GSO facilitated return that Lynn was speaking about. So far this year, in 2023, UNHCR has verified 3,296 returns. And I'll turn back to you, Ruba. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Sorry, but I'm just wary of time, and I know that you all will get the chance to come back to some of these issues again. Leon, we are heard from Tracy, from Fuad, Fadi, Ali, Syrian refugees. This is their intention. Syrian refugees, this is they're returning, they're not returning. Can we really speak of a bulk of the Syrian refugees? Or shouldn't we start to unpack a little bit this demographic in the search of more realistic solution, perhaps, that guarantee a gradual but definitely a safe, voluntary, and dignified return to some of the segments within the population as part of a step-for-step in coordination with the international community?
Okay, Ruba. Mass return might not be possible, but we can't disregard the fact that there are segments, there are refugees in Lebanon who are willing to go back to Syria despite the achievement of a political solution or not. And one lesson learned from the previous return experiences is that we need to start approaching the file of refugees differently. We think of refugees as this mass homogeneous group that can return whenever the war stops in Syria, whereas the reality is a little bit more complex than that. Indeed, the majority of the refugees here in Lebanon has fled Syria between 2011 and 2015. They're mostly from the Sunni countrysides, which were heavily targeted, that as they constitute the main incubator for the revolution against the regime. There is more into the refugee narrative than only that. And at SAWA, we've already started to break down the term or the narrative of refugees in Lebanon. And we're trying to tackle it from the perspective of four main classifications. First, their social composition. Refugees are men who fled military service, women who have become economically empowered here in Lebanon, their youth who are trying to escape the military conscription, and children who are growing up here as a second generation of the war. Options of return differs and vary between these segments, and it's not only one. We're trying to see the geographic distribution of refugees and their economic compositions. The majority of the refugees are mainly from the majority of refugees in Lebanon mainly come from Hamas, they come from Aleppo, they come from Damascus, and they're outstrikes. And they live in the north and Bekaa area. Some of them live in informal settlements, some of them live in rural areas, but each of these people have faced different kinds of pressures. And their conditions to return to their areas of origin also differs accordingly. we're trying to see what are the varying conditions for refugees, or what are the reasons that are preventing refugees in Lebanon from returning to Syria. And I think Tracy has already mentioned some, but I would like to highlight them again. Military service is one of them. The tightened security approach is one of them. The loss of property inside Syria is one of them. Loss of documentation. Many refugees cannot go back or face issues documenting their properties even. Economic deterioration, lack of security, social stigma. As for their intention of return, and this is the fourth category, some people are waiting for a political solution to think about return. Others have lost their loved ones. Others are willing to go back if the economic conditions get better, if there is a protection. So this breaking down of refugee narrative will allow us to identify the reasons that prevent people from going back to Syria, break down the problem of return, categorize the challenges, and consequently start designing evidence-based intervention, programs, policies that seek small solutions that allow a gradual return to be facilitated in each area separately, only, and this is only if the necessary conditions are met in these and in some of the areas of return. And this is where the gradual return must be facilitated under the Guy Pedersen step-to-step principle, which requires coordination on different levels, political level, the EU, non-EU policymakers, the UN, the international organizations, and Syrian and Lebanese civil societies. So, for example, if you want to take the example of refugees who are willing to go back to Syria, but they cannot do that for economic reasons, the return can be facilitated in exchange of injection of funding in Syria to support early recovery projects. But the regime must, on the other hand, change its policies towards managing its financial aid policies, allows more monitoring for international supervision, and allowing more space for NGOs in Lebanon and in Syria to operate in this.
Which are all imaginary, unrealistic solutions.
Unfortunately, but in this situation, despite the step-for-step solution, it's very important to start with unpacking the term of Syrian refugees, so we can actually find solutions. And whether it continues as a step-for-step or mass return, this step is very crucial to take place, and maybe it can be a key to deconstruct the return problem.
Thank you very much, Heen. Indeed, we need to start maybe thinking and addressing the issue of return differently, while, as you said, ensuring that it is always a safe and dignified and voluntary return, and only if the conditions are in place. So while we may put the conditions we think are viable, I think it may take a very long time for it to be applicable, or for the political negotiations around it to actually happen. On a more realistic note today, what are the obstacles that Syrian refugees are still facing that prevent them from return? When they talk about these intentions of return, I mean, a very, very, very minor proportion say they want to return because there are conditions that they need but are still not present. Can you tell us a little bit from your experience working with refugees in the past 12 years, what are some of these obstacles preventing return?
I think there are so many obstacles, and the situation of Syria in Syria and the reasons behind all this number of refugees is so complicated. And unfortunately, I think in the last few weeks and months, we've been hearing in the Lebanese media some populistic rhetoric that simplifies the Syrian issue and cause as if it was something similar to the earthquake that happened. So the war, according to this rhetoric, the war has ended in Syria. So all the refugees need to go back is some international funding for them to be able to go back and rebuild. But very few are talking about the underlying causes of this mass exodus from Syria. That one of the things that happened during the war was demographic engineering, re-engineering of the country that targeted specific areas where there was close, where Alawite and Sunni community lived nearby. So the Sunni communities were pushed away, especially in Homs area, and the Asi basin. Also, there was a big push of the Sunni population around Damascus. So, and those people won't be able to return soon. Let us take the Yarmouk Palestinian camp in Damascus, for instance. A lot of Palestinian factions are friendly with the Syrian regime. Why the regime hasn't allowed yet the reconstruction of Yarmouk camp and the return of the Yarmouk? There is also the issue of the villages that are occupied by Lebanese militias and fighters, and preventing their inhabitants from going back. Let's take the Qusayr and the Qalamoun area villages. A lot of the refugees in Beqa are from this area. Where are they going to go to? Yani, it is very easy to say words. Yani. Some Lebanese friend the other day was telling me why they don't go to Latakia and Tartus. The regime won't let them go to Latakia and Tartus. Yani they, in the 10 years, they tried their best to push the Sunnis away from the Alawite community. So now they are going to let them go in that easy. So this is on the political and demographic engineering side. Other factors were mentioned by the other speakers. There is, of course, there is the whole huge destruction, the lack of infrastructure. Yani, a lot of the people we meet tell us, you know, especially those living in the camps, tell us, you know, خلاص, we don't have any future ahead of us. Our life will be of misery our whole life. What we hope for is our children to be able to have a chance in life. So if we are staying in Lebanon, it's for them to receive education. If we go to Syria, to the place we come from Syria, where the schools are destroyed, the infrastructure is destroyed, there is no hope for them to get any kind of education. And this is a very important factor. A lot of parents are taking this into perspective. Even if they consider one day going back to Syria or sending their children abroad to Europe or to the Arab Gulf countries, they know that they cannot make it in life without proper education. And this is what they are fighting for. You add to this, of course, the issue of health, infrastructure, and the absence until the day the suburbs of Damascus, Douma, and Babila, and others are collectively punished by the regime by not allowing any reconstruction of the health facilities that he shelled himself during the years of war. So people, if they want to go to the hospital, they have to drive for kilometers and checkpoints to reach Damascus and check in hospitals where they are already overcrowded. And last but not least, the levels of poverty in Syria today have reached a point where Syrians who do not have someone abroad sending them money, they cannot survive. The inflation of the currency, the inflation in Syria, the loss of the currency value, the lack of work opportunities is making life very difficult. I don't know anyone of my friends and families who are able to survive without external support. And the earthquake crisis made it even more difficult. A lot of people in the northern part of Syria lost their livelihoods. They lost, during the war, they lost all of their savings, and now they find themselves poorer than to be able to even restore or repair their apartments.
Fadi, as you said, the list is long, the obstacles are many, and the picture is very gloomy. But there are most refugees who are still living in Lebanon today. And while we are looking at inside Syria conditions, I'm sure also due to the recent security crackdown in Lebanon, there has been impacts on the living situation of refugees in Lebanon. Tracy, I want to come to you and ask you, how do you think the latest restriction, the latest crackdowns have impacted the protection space for refugees in Lebanon? Do we see new restrictions? Do we see new difficult lived realities? What is the current situation in Lebanon for refugees who cannot go back or are not intending to do so in the near future.
Thank you. Thank you. As you know, the situation has gotten really complicated here and has gotten more restrictive in certain manners. We regularly receive reports of measures that are targeting Syrians. You know, we're talking about things like crackdowns on employment of Syrians in certain locations or job sectors. We're talking about increased scrutiny of businesses owned by Syrians. We're talking about taxes or levies that are imposed on Syrian-owned businesses, and population surveys as well that are conducted, particularly in informal settlements, but also in different communities across the country where they're asking Syrians to go and register themselves with the municipalities. Lately, we've seen a lot of curfews being imposed by municipalities. And there's the protection monitoring that we do indicates that Syrian households that are living under curfews are reporting increased levels of physical and verbal abuse. This is very, very concerning and a little bit newer, something that wasn't so much prevalent in the past. And I mean, we understand the frustrations in the country. We understand the multiple crises. People are frustrated, but the increasing narrative against refugees is harming everyone. So, you know, as we keep saying, to meet the needs of all Lebanese society, UNHCR and our partners continue to advocate for more support to Lebanon and its people. But we'd really like to see the current level of frustrations go down. Recently, we've been particularly concerned, which was also discussed a little bit at the beginning, about the large number of raids and other operations at checkpoints, as well as patrols that were being conducted by the Lebanese armed forces, targeting urban residential areas with high proportion of Syrian refugees. It began in early April and continued through May, and created a lot of fear amongst the Syrian population, as has already been discussed. These were primarily targeting Syrians without residency permits. And since these operations, UNHCR is aware of a significant number of Syrians that were arrested and immediately deported. And as mentioned earlier, some who were registered with us. The speed at which the deportations happened in this case, without due process, primarily, made it difficult for UNHCR to intervene on these cases. In this, UNHCR was aware of reports of family separation, children being deported alone or left behind following the deportation of their family. And you know, these families contacted UNHCR, and we've sought to provide both support to the remaining families, and we continue to do so with our partners. We've also documented the wider impact of the fear that we've discussed a little bit today among the refugee community that these raids and deportations sparked. And people have limited their movements, they continue to, and this has also impacted services. So let me just close. I get asked a lot what UNHCR is doing about this.
I didn't want to ask, so it's good you brought it up.
Great. You know, what are we doing? We're doing quite a lot. With regard to advocacy, we've been really pushing for upholding protection principles. Along with our allies, UNHCR has, you know, looked at the merits of private advocacy behind closed doors versus speaking out publicly. We do this all the time on a situation by situation basis, and where it's possible, we try to have a coordinated approach with civil society and others, so with yourselves. With the raids and deportations, our objective was to see them stop, right? That was the main objective in this. So we raised the issues urgently and directly with government counterparts, alongside other interlocutors. And ultimately, the latest raids and deportations were discontinued. We do still see some individual arrests, but there are no large-scale raids resulting in deportations at this point in time. During this, obviously, we've also been communicating directly with refugees. It's really essential but also challenging in an environment where sensitive material frequently shows up in the media. So we issued a letter to all refugees when the deportations began with advice on carrying documents, contact details, and we continue to work with our counseling lines and our partners, outreach volunteers, to be communicating to the refugees. We're always open to hearing how we should be doing this differently. So if you have suggestions, please let us know. UNHCR and our partners also, through our protection programs, aim to provide the practical, legal, and other forms of support to assist refugees during this period. Through the coordination structure under the LCRP, we've collectively engaged on how best to adapt programs within the current context. I noted refugees are limiting movements, and how can we make sure refugees are supported through protection by presence. Finally, I'm almost done, Ruba. We continue to engage directly with the governments, and we urge others to do the same on the need to uphold voluntary, safe, and dignified nature of all returns. This includes in relation to GSO facilitated returns. And we've also advocated for restoring the presence of UNHCR at the borders to engage in border monitoring. So in closing, we really hope that the Brussels conference provides a much needed moment, once again, to focus attention on the need for essential changes inside Syria if the confidence of refugees is to be built to engage in voluntary return.
Thank you so much, Tracy. This is very helpful because many assume, the lack of of position, which is out there as a silence of the agency, but it's helpful to know that behind closed doors, a lot is happening, and we are all allies in ensuring refugee and Syrian in general protection, each on our own way and from our own positionality. علي رح ارجع لعندك. بعرف انه انت كعلي ومع زملائك دائما عم تحاولوا تبحثوا عن حلول قابلة للتطبيق وكمان بتضمن كرامة الانسان اللاجئ. هل تعتقد انه اليوم الشيء اللي ما صار ب 12 سنة الماضيين ممكن يصير اليوم لأول مرة بلبنان، انه نبلش نفكر او نشهد تنظيم للوجود السوري بلبنان لنخفف من هذا الاحتقان اللي عم بصير؟ هل إذا في هيك خطة ممكن تنجح، كيف ممكن المجتمع المدني يلعب دور بهيك عملية إذا قدرنا نفكر فيها بهي الطريقة؟ ميوتد يا علي.
الواقع السياسي بلبنان لا يشجع على أي إمكانية حدوث خرق نوعي بهذا المحل، بس بنفس الوقت في بعض الحلول اللي ممكن نفكر فيها وبدها دعم دولي وبدها حلول وسط، وإنه ما نبقى عم نحكي بعالمين متوازيين. يعني الوضع بلبنان، لا مش كل اللبنانيين عنصريين، ومش كل اللبنانيين مش متضامنين مع الشعب السوري، وهيدي الناس موجودة بالمجتمع اللبناني وممنوع نعمم، وما بيسوى نعمم من جهة تانية ما في تساهل مع خطاب الكراهية. أنا بعتقد كل ما قرارات منع التنقل بالبلديات هذه إهانة على جبين كل حدا مواطن لبناني، لأنها خرق للدستور وغيره يجب أن تتوقف. وما توقفت ب 12 سنة ما بيعني إنه ما لازم. ممنوع البلديات تطلع هيك قرارات، هذا موضوع غير قابل للنقاش وغير قابل للمساومة لو قد ما كان الوضع صعب بلبنان. بالمقابل بعتقد علينا أن نعترف أن اللجوء في لبنان هو مشكلة ضاغطة على المجتمع اللبناني. خلينا نبلش منهم، وهذا الموضوع ما كتير بينحكى فيه وما كتير بنحب ينحكى فيه، بفهم كل واحد من زاويته، ولكن إذا في أهمية لهيدا الشيء هو نعرف أهمية إنه ندرك أن فعلا المجتمع اللبناني مرهق ومتعب، ولكن بنفس الوقت لازم نفكر بجدية لنسحب هذا الموضوع من النقاش الشعبوي وخطاب الكراهية لحلول عملية. خلينا نكون واضحين، لا حل كامل لمسألة اللجوء في لبنان أو في أي بلد آخر إلا ضمن ثلاثية حل سياسي شامل إعادة إعمار وحل لاجئين. بالمقابل هون لين اللي حكيته كان متقدم برأيي أنا. تعالوا نفكر كيف ننظم هذا الوضع. أول شغلة على الدولة اللبنانية أن تعملها، هنالك حاجة استراتيجية لبنانية أن يتم وقف فكرة عدم التسجيل. على الدولة اللبنانية أن تقوم بواجبها تجاه نفسها، وإذا بتأمل أنه في عودة. اليوم إذا بيصير في حل سياسي وعدد السوريين والسوريات غير المسجلين والزيجات غير المسجلة والولادات غير المسجلة، لبنان بده 10 سنين ما في يطلع السوريين دي راغبين إذا صار في حل سياسي. وهون مسؤولية الدولة اللبنانية بتوزيع المسؤوليات اللي حكي عنه فادي. وهيدا نحن خيارنا ضمن المجتمع اللبناني بنضالنا السياسي اليومي، أن لا نستسلم أمام الكذب، أمام الرياء، وأمام العنصرية. المسؤول الأول عن أزمة اللاجئين علينا أن نذكر هو النظام السوري. وثانياً حلفاء اللبنانيين ليتفضلوا يقدم إشارات جدية بهذا المحل، يتفضل يفتح المجال للناس تروح على القلمون أو على ريف حمص الشرقي. هيدا كله حكي، وأنا موافق تحليل تماماً على التحليل والتوصيف اللي عملوا فيه. شيء منهجي صار بسوريا. النقطة الثالثة هي خليني أقول نحن وعم نثبت هذا الأمر، علينا أن نبحث عن حلول بهذا الإطار. بموضوع سوق العمل مثلا، ما حدا رح يكون واهم، لا يمكن تنظيم سوق العمل للسوريين في لبنان لسبب بسيط، أن سوق العمل غير منظم في لبنان. خلينا نبلش من هون. ما في ضمان اجتماعي للبنانيين لنحكي عن ضمان اجتماعي للسوريين. لبنان بحاجة للمعلومات، ولكن أيضاً نحن بحاجة لنلاقي صيغ. ما عندي تصور متكامل شو هي حول عملية تجزيء اللاجئين. وهون أنا عم بطرح أسئلة، عن جد عم بطرح أسئلة لنقدر نوصل لصيغة مشتركة مش ترضي على المراد والجوريثم الفيسبوك اللي أنا عايش فيه. لكون هالشفافية لنحكي مع عموم المجتمع اللبناني لنقدر نواجه صح خطاب الكراهية. ما هو الأشخاص الذين ينتقلوا عبر الحدود لأن منهم كتار بالمناسبة؟ شو وضعهم؟ هذا للنقاش. اللاجئ الاقتصادي في بلد منهار بحد ذاته شو بده يكون وضعه؟ كمان هذا للنقاش. في مواضيع بعتقد نحن بحاجة نجزئ لنقدر فعلا نوصل لصيغ مشتركة. أنا بعرف إنه اللي عم يطلعوا يجوا ما بيشكلوا أغلبية بهذا المحل. الدولة اللبنانية عليها أولا أن تقوم بوجه، مش تروح تقول للUNHCR اعطيني المعلومات. أنت شغلتك كدولة لبنانية تجمع المعلومات. هلا ما بعرف شو الصيغة اللي رح يعملوها الUNHCR بهذا المحل. الحديث إنه يا بننطر الحل السياسي يا ما بنعمل شيء، هيدي بعتقد لازم نفكر كلنا بعمق كيف نستطيع أن نتجاوزها. بدي زيد بعد كنت نقطة بهذا المحل، هو صح في خطاب عنصري شديد بلبنان وكريه بالنسبة لنا كلبنانيين، لا نقبل أن نتحمل. ولكن بنفس الوقت على الرغم من كل التعبئة الممنهجة اللي صارت، علينا أن نعترف أننا لم نشهد جرائم كراهية في لبنان. خلينا نقول هيدا الشيء مش لخفف من عبء هيدا الشيء، بس كمان لننظر أنه هذا المجتمع اللبناني بكل أزماته وبكل مآسيه وبكل مواقفه المسبقة وبكل الالتباس التاريخي اللي عمره من عمر البلدين، لم يشهد هذا البلد جريمة كراهية. في حكومات سقطت بأوروبا، في دول طلعت من الاتحاد الأوروبي، في مجتمع أوروبي كله وقف على إجر وحدة. ما بعرف كيف رح يترجموها هلا، وقف على إجر وحدة. إيه؟ في حين هذا المجتمع اللبناني بالرغم من كل مآسيه ومن كل خطاب العنصرية هنالك حاضنة اجتماعية متعاونة، ويمكن ما بتعبر عنها صوت الكراهية بيكون أعلى. وللأسف أن الدولة اللبنانية باستقالتها من هذا الدور لا شاركت بمؤتمر اللجنة الخماسية، ولا مستعدة تقدم أي حل، تريد أن تستخدم هذا الملف في الابتزاز السياسي لتحصيل أمور وفي الابتزاز الداخلي بس بدهم بيطلعوا. واليوم كل من كان يتحدث اختفى.
مساعدات كمان.
ماذا سنفعل نحن؟ هذا التحدي علينا. هل علينا أن ننتظر بعد كم شهر موجة جديدة من التعبئة، مرشح جديد لرئاسة الجمهورية صديق بشار الأسد وحزب الله ليجي يقول له للشعب اللبناني أنا برجع لك السوريين؟ هو كله كذب. أو بدنا نبلش نفكر بطريقة مختلفة كي نخرج قسم كبير من اللبنانيين القلقين ولكن اللي منهم بالجانب الآخر. في فئة عنصرية ما في حل معها، وفئة حاقدة على الشعب السوري وعلى إن كان على الشعب السوري أو على ثورة الشعب السوري، واحدة من اثنين أو اثنين. اليوم في جزء من اللبنانيين عندهم مشكل ديموغرافي، في جزء عندهم مشكل أمني، في جزء عنده مشكل اقتصادي تنموي. خلينا كمان نجزئ بنظرتنا للبنانيين. ليس كل من يطرح سؤال بالمجتمع اللبناني حول إشكالية اللجوء هو عنصري كامل. ما حابب أكون بموقع الدفاع لأنه أنا موافق على كل اللي عم تقولوه، وبعتقد يعني يمكن ما بعرف إذا القسم اللي بيعرفني أو غيره منه بهالمحل، بس أنا حابب استفيد من هاي الجلسة لنحكي بصراحة ونتعاون. نحن بحاجة للتعاون لبناء سردية جديدة بعد 12 سنة وسنين لقدام. كيف يمكن التعامل مع هذا الموضوع؟ ما قدم حتى اليوم برأيي في ظل ما يعاني منه لبنان من تحلل الدولة أخاف من الانفجار.
تمام علي، تمام. صورة واضحة وشاملة، وشكرا كثير للإنبوت تبعك، وبتخلينا نفكر كمان بطريقة مختلفة. دكتور فؤاد، يعني I will come to you for closing, and then I will give it to the attendees to ask their questions. So if you have any questions, please raise your hands and I will give you the chance to ask your question directly. But Dr. Fuad, is it possible, in the light of everything we have heard, to put forward a rational plan or a roadmap for a voluntary and safe return for Syrian refugees, whilst not, as Ali said, waiting for the political solution in Syria to happen, because we know that this has been at a stalemate for many years now? And if so, who, in your opinion, are the stakeholders and what could be their different roles in that?
Well, thank you, Ruba, and yani, sorry to disappoint you of having like a closing conclusion of this, because I think it's most difficult. I may even open other doors. Let me put something that could be unpopular and even against the entire narrative of our panel today, which is about return. I think not because I think, but because also of refugee studies, because of what Tracy mentioned about only 1% of Syrian refugees want to return in the coming year, because of these protracted long-term crises in Syria is not a unique, is not the only one. Because historically, we don't know any case of protracted long-term crises that people return in mass numbers. So the conclusion of that, there's no near return, not in next year, not in the next decade. And, you know, I'm really sorry to say that could be a sort of something very long-term. I would go back to what Ali actually put it in that way. I think, yes, definitely we don't need to wait for the political solution, definitely, because that could not happen soon, or maybe it could not happen never. But I think there is a sort of an action or actions could be done. One is, yes, I agree with Ali, with all what Ali mentioned about that there is a need to see the responsibilities of different actors in this big major issue. One is, yes, the Lebanese government, you know, to take this issue. Second is the, you know, the representation, if any, or representatives of Syrians in general, whether in the exile or refugees or NGOs, And third, the international community, including the UN agencies and other international organizations. There is a need now to start thinking about what could be done to mitigate all these issues of, consequences of being in a long-term refuge, the burden on the host communities, and specifically here in Lebanon. I do agree. This is, we're talking about, 20-25% of population are refugees, and in a country that collapsed, almost collapsed, or maybe already collapsed, but without having very I mean, I've never, like Ali, I've never heard about, sort of a sort of crimes, targeting Syrians, maybe very few. So then what should be done? The dialogue, the conversation, the discussions should be open actually, and need to have to ask the real questions. What if there's no near return? What if the international, unfortunately, international communities, do not want to jump in and take the responsibility of resettlement. Tracy mentioned, I think, about, not Tracy, I read that in the UNHCR document, that last year only 7,000 or so resettled in 13 countries. We didn't mention to resettlement, here, which is what's the responsibility of international communities. So I think there is a need now to not just talking about return per se, but we need to see what if there is no near return, and what is the responsibility of the international communities in that regard. I will stop here with these two big questions in a hope that next time we're just not talking about safe return and voluntary return, because yes, these are principles, but well, beyond the issue of principles, what are the practical issues to be done, and then what are the roadmap, as you mentioned, to do it? Over to you.
Yeah, Fuad, يعني, honestly, so many questions, so little answers, so many complexities. I should have allowed you and Ali to talk first and then open up for discussion. No, but thank you very much for everyone's contribution. I think it was a very balanced picture that we were able to draw, a lot of insights, a lot of new ways of looking at it, and a lot of reminders of like the difficult situation and the challenging and complex situation that we are facing. I'm going to now open it up to discussion. Some raised hands and some others who had written in the chat that they had questions. I will allow you to ask your questions, and please, if you keep it brief, and if you also, if you have someone in mind in particular that you are addressing the question to, please mention the name of the speaker. I will start with you, Sibyl, if you still have your question, because I know you raised your hand since the beginning of the panel. I will unmute you, and if you have the question, please go ahead. Sibyl, we can hear you. Hello? Actually, we cannot hear you, although you are unmuted. Okay, Sibyl, please try to fix your mic situation. I will come back to you. In the meantime, I will go to Fatima. Fatima, I have asked to unmute you, so if you can unmute yourself and go ahead, please. Okay. I will try then with you, Lavinia. I'm asking to unmute you, so please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. So first, thank you everyone to all the speakers. I wanted to ask some questions. So I come from a legal background, so I hope I'm not gonna drag the discussion somewhere else. But I wanted to ask whether, from a formal point of view, there is a legal basis that is being used from the Lebanese government to perform the deportations. And also if there has been any challenge in court, whether national or international courts, from individuals or civil society organizations to kind of counter the deportation orders? And if so, if there has been any outcome.
Thank you so much, Lavinia. Noor, you had questions in the chat. I will give you the chance to ask them directly if you still want to. I've asked to unmute you.
Thank you, Ruba. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks so much for this engaging discussion. The first question was already asked just by our colleague who asked it a second ago about legal pretext for the deportations. My second question was whether any panelists are aware of any new or refreshed discussions happening on a pan-Arab level about the fate of Syrian refugee resettlement long-term. Has this new wave of forced a return caused any new discussions that you're aware of? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Noor. I will take 2 more questions and allow the speakers to answer. Bassem, please go ahead. Bassem?
Thank you. I'm Wafa Basim.
Sorry.
I'm a member of the Human Rights Committee on Civil and Political Rights, elected by the UN. I have a question concerning Syrian refugees, but with other adjacent countries, like would there be any coordination with Jordan, for instance, with Egypt, with I would even go beyond that, with Iraq, with Turkey, about a common action or common criteria for the return of the Syrian refugees to Syria? And how would that be coordinated with the IMO together with the UNHCR contribute in that respect? And what shall we do with those who do not want to return? Like they are well established in their refugee homes, and like cases we have here in Egypt. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wafa. I'm going to take the last question from Gilles and allow the panelists to respond and close, maybe since we don't have any further questions. Gilles, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you, Ruber. Thank you to all of the speakers. I'm Jill Alpes. I'm a senior researcher at the Human Rights Center at Ghent University. And I have a question to Lean Kasaibi. Sorry, I'm a bit out of breath. I wanted to ask where we could read up about the exact numbers of Syrian citizens who have not received permission or clearance to be readmitted by GSO to Syria, on whether Sawa had been doing any research on this. And with my apologies, I have a medical appointment in 10 minutes, so I hope I can catch the answer. Thank you so much.
Don't worry, Jill, don't worry at all. Thank you very much for your concern and for following up the panel on your way to your appointment. Any of the panelists would like to start? Please give me a sign and go ahead. Go ahead, Ali, please.
سريعا بالنسبة لموقف الجيش اللبناني من عملية الترحيل الأخيرة، ما كتير واضح السبب المباشر. كتير سمعنا روايات مرتبطة بالوضع السياسي، ممكن هل مرتبطة بملف رئاسة الجمهورية، مش أكيد. البعض كان عم بيقول ازدحام السجون عند الجيش اللبناني وغيره، هل هي نوع من الحالة الشعبوية؟ على الأرجح. ولكن خليني أقول أنه الدولة اللبنانية غير قادرة لكتير أسباب أنها تلجأ لترحيل قسري إلى داخل الأراضي السورية، وعلما أنه في ظل المعابر غير الشرعية وأصلا موقف النظام بسوريا، أي حدا سيتم إبعاده إلى داخل الأراضي السورية يستطيع أن يعود إلى الأراضي اللبنانية. وبالتالي هذا الموضوع منه حل، ومجددا يعني حتى لو كانت الدولة اللبنانية تريد أن توظف التضييق على اللاجئين السوريين من أجل تسجيل نقاط، هي حتى هذا الأمر عاجزة أن أنها تعمل. رح أعطي مثل بسيط. خلال مؤتمر لندن بالعام 2016 بس لنعرف الواقع اللبناني شو هو، رئيس الوزراء ووزير الشؤون الاجتماعية ما كانوا بيحكوا مع وزير الخارجية، فالمستشارين كانوا عمليا عم بيقودوا المفاوضات بين داخل الفريق اللبناني اللي رايح يفاوض بالخارج. فبس كنت حابب اعطي هيدي الملاحظه. يمكن جواب هيك كمان سريع للتذكير، يمكن اللي مش متابعين، لبنان غير موقع على اتفاقيه ال 51 ويستمر على التعاطي مع كلمه النازحين ولا يستعمل كلمه لاجئين، وهذا خطا يعني بديهي لا يمكن حتى اصلا القبول فيه ولا حدا بيقبله. السوريين الموجودين في لبنان هم لاجئون دون اي شك. لا اعتقد ان موجه الابعاد القسري ستستمر، ولكن اللي بينخاف منه هو عمليه تضييق تستمر وشديده على حياه اللاجئين السوريين، خاصه انه يعني البعض عم ببلش يطلع خطاب انه اذا بتوقفوا عنه المساعدات رح يرجعوا على سوريا. هيدي كمان بدنا نعرف كيف بدنا نقدر نتصدى لها داخل الراي العام، تحديدا لانه الموضوع مرتبط ايضا بالبرسبشن، بالانطباعات. يعني عمليا الليره اللبنانيه انهارت بشكل مخيف، فصار المواطن اللبناني حقده كله عم بيوصفوا على اللاجئ السوري، بمعنى الواقع الحالي اليوم يضع الفقراء اللبنانيين بوجه الفقراء السوريين، وهي اشكاليه كبيره. يعني بدها بحث معمق مثل ما كان عم بيقول فؤاد، ولا نكتفي فقط بالتوصيف وبالادانه.
شكرا كثير علي على بعض الأجوبة اللي قدمتها. دكتور فؤاد.
Thank you, Ruba. I tried just to comment, but I will leave the answer maybe Tracy to what Mrs. Wafat Basim mentioned about the other examples from other countries. I think this is also something important to mention, which is it's quite strange after also 11 years that we don't have information about return or willing to return for Syrians in other destination or other hosting communities, and that by itself could be something to see, to compare between different contexts, to see different conditions. You know, all these issues could be an issue to push toward more durable solution. And I think what she suggested as a sort of a question is could be something, an action to do, to see what are the other conditions or in the other countries that host Syrian refugees. And I will stop here. Just this is as a sort of a comment on her excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fuad. Tracy.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you, Dr. Fuad. I was going to ask to come in on that question because I do think it's important for us to understand and to clarify. So typically when it's deemed that large-scale sort of facilitated or promoted return is possible in a country, then UNHCR with the hosting countries and the country of asylum, so this would include all of the hosting countries, will form commissions to really look at and make plans, solid plans for what we think will be large-scale return movements. At the current time, I think, as we've discussed during this panel, we're not really at that situation in Syria. We're not promoting large-scale facilitated return. So that's why those commissions, tripartite commissions they're often called, but also multi-party, have not been formed yet. However, they will be formed at a point in time when we all think the situation in Syria has changed. And that kind of goes back to what Ali was talking about right at the beginning of this session, I'll stop here, is we really need to collectively look at addressing the root causes of the conflict and the movement, which is then having the impact in Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Lean?
Hi, okay, but just to clarify something that Dr. Ali mentioned, which is that the responsible entity for the Syrian refugee file is technically the General Security. And it was very interesting, the use of the army in the recent security campaigns that were happening in Lebanon. And maybe this could be justifiable because of the army's role in preserving the national security. And maybe it's also related to the presidency file in Lebanon as a form of pressure that if the next president that is elected, who can be an ally of Syrian government, can be able to get refugees back to Lebanon. So this is briefly to answer the first question. And to answer your question, Jill, we have got these numbers through the research that we've done. We've also intersected these information with other information from different sources that we have on the ground. If you want, we can talk about it more if you send me an email, and we can discuss it further.
Thank you so much. Lastly, I will give Fadi the chance to close and say any responses or remarks that you still may have. Fadi, please go ahead.
I just want to end by saying, although we have been using words like racism and deportation a lot, but as Ali said, as Syrians, we need also to acknowledge the hospitality of the Lebanese population towards Syrians and the generosity that we were hosted in the last few years. If you take the numbers of refugees to the total population, the number of incidents registered is nothing. So here in Lebanon, we need really to distinguish between the formal populistic rhetoric of the media and the day-to-day dealings between people on the ground, that these are two different things, that the rhetoric on the media do not reflect the realities on the ground. Syrians have been living and working in Lebanon way before that, and have many of them have managed to make family ties and business ties with the Lebanese. So we need to be, everything needs to be put in its right place. We need to be thankful also for all these years of generosity. But of course, there is a lot to work on. I am with Ali. I think if we need a solution for the crisis, the Lebanese authorities need to be honest with the population by telling them what are the obstacles, that this is going to be a long-term solution, and we need to meanwhile manage and organize the Syrian presence. I left Lebanon this week after living there for 13 years. In these 13 years, I've never been able to get work permits, although I established an organization that employs 70 Lebanese persons. So these are some of the things that need to be tackled and managed. Acknowledge that Syrians are an essential workforce that Lebanon cannot get rid of immediately, and working on this and taking this into consideration while negotiating with both the international community and the Syrian regime on dignified ways for return. And I want also to highlight what Tracy said, that the international support for Lebanon this year was shameful. I hope next week in Brussels we can shake things up and encourage donors to give more money to the Lebanon response, because this way we are leading things to explode on the social level. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I don't know if any of the panelists have a two-finger or anything else to add. Otherwise, I would like to thank everyone for showing up on a timely manner from the attendees. And I want to thank the panelists for being so timely in your responses We are at 4:29, and I'm very happy to be closing on time because I know everyone has a lot on. But I do think that this conversation really allowed us to start thinking collectively of new ways to talk about the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon, to start thinking about new paradigms, new solutions, to start unpacking a little bit the term Syrian refugees and look at different cases within, while acknowledging the complexity of the protection space in Lebanon, while acknowledging the difficult situation in Lebanon, and while definitely acknowledging that the conditions inside Syria are definitely not in place for everyone to return and for the majority of refugees to return immediately. So I think this is a very good start. I extend my hand as Tower for Development and Aid, and I talk on behalf of all the speakers. Please, whoever wants to join forces to continue this conversation, please reach out to us, to IFI, to the LPRND network, and to any of our speakers as well, to continue this conversation collectively. Thank you, everyone. Best of luck to all of those attending Brussels. Let's continue pushing for the right agendas, for the right issues to be on the table, and definitely for increased and continued support to the Syrian and to the host communities as well. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.